The headlines. Doctors were summoned to the home of the Health Secretary last night to treat him for extreme dehydration. Paramedics reportedly discovered the Secretary on the floor, crawling towards his bathroom through piles of used COVID test kits, groaning for water. Apparently, in an attempt to meet the government's promise of 100,000 tests a day, the Secretary of State resorted to swabbing himself 40,000 times. A spokesman commented, "This is a wonderful example of our government's determination to keep its promises, and we hope to see him back as soon as he has been rehydrated. Meanwhile, better stay off those digestive biscuits." When questions were raised about why the tests were not given to frontline workers, the government responded, "Hey, first of all, the Health Secretary runs the NHS does frontline work. Secondly, we said 100,000 tests. We didn't say they had to be on different people. So shut up." Meanwhile, the Prime Minister received congratulations on the birth of his newborn child and commented, "I told you I keep my promises. I said we were expecting a baby in early summer, and here we are. Credit where credit's due, please." Journalists responded by pointing out that A, surely the mother is the one who deserves the credit for giving birth, and B, April never counts as summer in the United Kingdom. Was this simply the latest case of the Prime Minister failing to deliver? In response, he said, "Of course I didn't deliver. The midwife delivered. Gotcha. I love this job." Next question. I'm Andy, that's all fake news, and you're watching Alverstoke Antiviral. Here we go. Hello and welcome to Alverstoke Antiviral. And here we have a very special interview this week. Pleased to bring you Howard and Joanne Morape. Good to see you.
Good to see you, Andy.
Hi, guys. How are you doing?
Wow. It's been a while since we talked. So yeah, we are fine, thank you. How are you doing?
Yeah, not bad, thank you. Not bad, thank you. It's been okay today, actually. I've had some very good news today. So yes, I'm very pleased about that. Yeah, I guess people will be wondering, how are the Mwapes coping? How have you been doing? How are the children? How has work been?
Well, it's been, at the beginning, it was quite difficult trying to get into the routine of everything, because everything is like just changed overnight, you know, so we had to start something else totally different from what we're used to. But at the beginning, it was quite challenging, especially with the kids being home and not being able to go outside, trying to explain to them that you can't go out, you can't go to school, you can't go shopping with me, and it was quite a challenge. But as the days went by, it's been much easier now. We've gotten into that routine that we needed. Yeah.
So do you think they've got used to it a bit?
Well, they are doing just fine, actually. So far, they're doing their work at least 2 hours every day. It's, I think from 10 to about 12 o'clock, we go through their homework, and we try to help them as much as we can. Everything is just turning out to be all right for them at the moment. They've had enough time. I think they think like they are on holiday at the moment.
A very long holiday.
Very long holiday. So it is all right. And at least it's gotten, we've spent most of the time with each other. So I'm glad for that anyway.
Oh, good. Are you able to get out of the house much and walk when you're not working or teaching your children?
Yes, they went cycling a few days ago, Howard and the boys.
Yeah, we decided to go cycling. Mostly, we are trying to keep Matthew indoors because of being asthmatic, and sometimes it is just too dry and there's too much pollen in the air. So we don't want to trigger his asthma. And we're just trying to keep him occupied in the house. So not going out much, but just entertaining them within the house, which is be hard work sometimes when they're on each other's throat. Yeah.
Yes, they do go out and play in the garden. whenever they get tired of being indoors.
Mm.
So yeah, that's what we're doing.
Yes. Now, Joanne, you've been doing some training to be a nurse, haven't you? How's that been happening?
Well, just everything, like I said, just changed overnight. So I was at placement when I got the news that I had to leave. So left, what was it, about a month ago? And I'm not going into placement, but lectures and assignments are just online at the moment. So everything is online. It's just that placement is on hold for me until hopefully things get much better. But other students have gone to work, those who are volunteered to work, but I'm staying home with the kids for now. Yeah.
Well, that has just happened to be okay for me because now my work is demanding more of me to be there, and they really want us to be out there. So her being at home looking after the kids is just helped out because we normally scratch our heads when it comes to childcare. And the way it is panning out, they want us to be spending at least 50% of the time at work. So during the week, so which has worked out all right for us because we've got one to stay at home and look after the kids. So that has really helped and has put my heart at rest. I mean, not really panicking when it comes to childcare.
Yes, and we just got some information that they might
be
sailing off next week.
At the end of the no, at the end of the month.
At the end of the month.
So so it's so we're asking for a little bit, of time so that we can have the ship shape.
I see. Yeah, we're at a very interesting stage at the moment because obviously the schools aren't back yet, and yet, as you say, jobs are starting to work maybe a bit more, some of them, and we might see places reopening soon. And so, how's it going to work? Who knows, really? I mean, do you have any thoughts about what we might have to expect over the next few weeks?
Well, what I'm thinking is that obviously they'll begin opening some of the workplaces, but then they're going to introduce the mask thing. You have to wear a mask if at all you're going to be going out. So I think that's what I'm hoping to happen for now. But it's time we are not trying to rush the opening in case we overwhelm the NHS. So we're just trying to do it slowly. Well, if I was the Prime Minister, but then we will have to wait and see what happens.
Yeah. There's something quite scary about everyone wearing masks in public. I don't like the thought of it, but I can understand why we might have to do that. Although, I suppose lots of people might make their own from scarves or something like that.
Yeah, I think people are already doing it because they're quite scarce to get. So it will be just an interesting environment to be in, because we're not used to that, seeing people with protective, gear on them and trying to explain to the kids, if everything is lifted, that they have to go out there but still wear the protective stuff. So it will be quite interesting.
Challenging for some kids as well, because once they've got a mask on, they want to touch it. They want to, whenever, scratch it or, pick touch it, thinking that they are protecting it. And actually says you're introducing bacteria to the mask if you keep touching it every now and then. Because whenever something is on your face, you tend to touch it without realizing it.
It will be quite interesting, but we put it in God's hands. We put everything in God's hands. We don't know, so God is in control of everything.
Are you both feeling spiritually encouraged as well? I mean, it's great to hear you saying we're trusting God and we're putting this in His hands. Have you found this a fruitful time spiritually as well?
Oh yes. As for us, we have been, just reading the Bible most of the time, and then just being at rest, knowing that, when you found the Lord, when the Lord is in you, and you know that whatever happens, He's in control. He's in you. He's beside you. He's everywhere when you're sleeping, when you're awake. So there's nothing more comforting than knowing that the Lord knows what you're going through. The Lord knows where you're coming from, where you are at, and where you're going through. So that is very comforting. Even what is happening around the world, it's not like He's lost control over it. He knows about what is happening. He's well aware of what is happening, and He's possibly allowed it to happen because nothing doesn't pass through the head office before it happens here on earth. So we just keep trusting in Him, and that's what really matters. Just putting our hope in the Lord, and whatever happens happens for a reason, and He knows about it.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, well, I'm sure people will be delighted to hear from you and delighted to pray for you. What can we pray for you at the moment?
For me, I've got my sister back home who's had several operations. We've been praying about it, the whole family, because she's been our firstborn, and she's looked after me. She's looked after most of us because she's more like a mother to me, and that we've prayed, but then she's still in intensive care, in and out. So we are a little bit worried. That's what's worrying us. But we always trust in the Lord that whatever happens, He knows about it, and He shall comfort her. And whenever we present our prayers to the Lord, He hears us. He may not have the answer that we need, but He's always hearing us whenever we pray.
Well, we'll definitely be praying for her then. Sorry to hear that. But Howard and Joan, thank you so much for joining us on this conversation, and take care. And look forward to seeing you when this is all over.
Yes.
Thank you.
Okay,
Bye-bye, Andy. Thank you for calling me.
Well, I'm joined here today with Colin. Good to see you, Colin. Today we're going to be talking about Joshua.
We are indeed, yes. So you've done a bit of work on Joshua prior to this meeting, not your usual off-the-cuff stuff. So I think it's a bit like a sandwich with a filling. What do you reckon about this book and what it's all about?
I think that's an interesting question. Here's my structure of Joshua. So Joshua, God gives the victory. That's what that says, if you can see under our heads. And tell me about the bacon sandwich.
So I was suggesting chapter 1, which is the commission of Joshua to lead the people into the land. And then you've got at the end, Joshua calling the people to a decision and a commitment to the God whom they've seen work throughout the passage. And then you've got, right at the beginning, you've got them entering the land, conquering Jericho, where it's very clear that this generation is quite different to the previous one, because they do exactly what God says to the letter. And then that continues on. If you think of Bacon with the conquering of an entrance into the land, then the lettuce is them proceeding to do that and how they do it. And then the tomato is how they take that land and divide it up amongst the various tribes, giving more to the bigger tribes and smaller amounts to the smaller tribes. Yeah. BLT sandwich.
A BLT sandwich. Yes, there we have it. Joshua, a structure like that. So it's at this moment where Moses is dead that it begins, because Deuteronomy ends with the death of Moses, and Israel are there on the cusp. And to understand what it's really about, I've put here God gives the victory. Let's just take a look at the very start of Joshua, because this is quite interesting. And Joshua starts like this. There we go. After the death of Moses, the servant of the Lord said to Joshua, son of Nun, Moses' aide, Moses, my servant, is dead. Now then, you and all these people get ready to cross the Jordan River into the land I am about to give them, to the Israelites. I will give you every piece of land where you set your foot, as I promised Moses. Your territory will extend from the desert to Lebanon, and from the great river, the Euphrates, all the Hittite country, to the Mediterranean Sea in the west. No one will be able to stand against you all the days of your life. As I was with Moses, so I will be with you. I will never leave you nor forsake you. Be strong and courageous, because you will lead these people to inherit the land I swore to their ancestors to give them. And I think the striking thing about that opening is that it starts in a bit of a scary moment, where the Israelites might be wondering, how are we actually going to cope now that Moses is gone? Moses has been the central human character for the last several books of the Bible. He's been key since the book of Exodus, and he's led them for 40 years, and now finally he's dead. How are they going to manage without Moses? And God speaks to Joshua in this moment, and he speaks to reassure him. And you see this, there's this promise that I will give you, verse 3, I will give you every place where you set your foot, as I promised Moses. And there's his reasoning. The reasoning is the promises of God. God has actually promised this land to this people, and that goes to Moses. It also goes all the way back to Abraham and God's plan to save the world through blessing the family of Abraham and giving them a new home, a place where they can rest and enjoy God's blessing. And now God says, I'm going to keep this promise. Your territory will extend from here to there, and no one will be able to stand against you. And the reasoning for that is, as I was with Moses, so I will be with you. So the idea here, that this command to be strong and courageous, is not just a random command to be brave for no reason. It's a command to be bold because you're standing on the promises of God, and you're trusting in a God who is with you, because Joshua has received these promises from God, that God will give him rest in the land. So that's what this is about. It's a call to be courageous right at the start, because God gives the victory, because he is faithful. And to jump back to our diagram here, you can really see this. It's all about God giving the victory. It's not the story of wonderful human heroic strength, really, the book of Joshua. It's the story of God giving the victory. You see that when they enter the land, because how do they get across the River Jordan at the beginning? How do they do that? Do they swim? Do they build a bridge? No, they wade in with the Ark of the Covenant, and the waters stop flowing. It's a deliberately strange supernatural river crossing that parallels the crossing of the Red Sea, where God makes it entirely clear that the only reason they're getting across is because he is there. He is the one bringing them into the promised land through the waters. And they set up a memorial to remember that God has done this, and it's his mighty power that brings them in. And it's God giving them the victory, secondly, in the conquering section, when we get famous things like the Battle of Jericho, which I'm sure you all know from Sunday school, maybe if you've been in Sunday school, this famous battle, which isn't really a normal battle. I've been watching quite a bit of EastEnders bits during lockdown for some reason. I know Colin looks appalled. And your lookalike, Phil Mitchell, is one of my favourite characters, because he's just a pure thug. You know, he gets in fights with everyone. And I keep having visions of what would happen if Phil Mitchell got in a fight with someone, and someone was throwing punches at his head, and his military strategy to overwhelm his opponent was to pull out a small trumpet, play some notes, and walk around slowly in a circle for 6 days. You know, that is not how you win a fight normally, is it? It's a very, very strange non-military strategy. But that's what God tells them to do, and that's what brings the walls of Jericho down, not Joshua's mighty strength necessarily, but the fact that God gives them this victory. They obey God's commands, and not because the trumpets are magic or anything, but because God is making the point that he is the one who brings the walls down. Joshua says this, 6:15. He says, "Shout, for the Lord has given you the city." God gives the victory. And you see that also in the other battles when the sun stands still and there is hail. At one point, 10:14, the narrator comments, "Surely the Lord was fighting for Israel." This is a God-given victory, a God-given conquest, dividing the land. And this is the headline of Joshua, really. God's promises are good, and God gives the victory. And you get to this wonderful climax somewhere around chapter 21, if we go back to the text, where we get this moment, which is the high watermark, really. Joshua 21. So the Lord gave Israel all the land he had sworn to give their ancestors, and they took possession of it and settled there. How long have we been waiting for that to happen in the story of the Bible? Since Genesis 12, we've been waiting for that. The Lord gave them rest on every side. Key word, rest. Just as God rested on the seventh day in Eden, in creation at the beginning. So now the land is a new Eden, a new place where rest can be had, harmony with God and creation. Just as he's sworn to their ancestors, what God has promised he has delivered. Not one of their enemies withstood them. The Lord gave all their enemies into their hands. Here's the tagline 45, not one of all the Lord's good promises to Israel failed. Dale Ralph Davis writes a commentary on Joshua, and his title is No Falling Words. No falling words from this verse, because the point is, as Joshua shows us the story of this conquest, we are seeing God keeping his promises and giving the victory and giving the land to the people, not in their strength, not by their accomplishments, but by his mighty power. And this is the uplifting aspect I want to really bring out about Joshua. We'll get onto the difficult stuff in a moment, but the big overarching thrust is that God gives the victory to his people. He gives them rest in the land. And we need to know that, but not only because we need to know we can trust his promises, but we need to see how these promises actually point to Jesus as well and help us understand Jesus, because Jesus says, come to me, all you who are weary and heavy laden, I will give you rest. I will give you rest. And the New Testament in Hebrews tells us the Old Testament saints were looking forward to another country, a heavenly one, not just the earthly land of Israel. And so in this way, the land is a picture of the rest in heaven and the new creation that God promises to give us in Jesus. You might know that Jesus' name is a version of Joshua's name, which comes from this verb to save. There is salvation in Joshua as God gives them the land and the victory. And that's a message we need to hear as Christians. We need to remember that God can be trusted to give us rest and bring us into his promised land. Even though the odds are against us, even though it's humanly impossible, even though we can't bring ourselves in. And I think that's a point, Colin, that we need to really hear in a difficult time, in a time where we might be focused on all sorts of things and troubled in our minds about the situation in the future, that actually God is faithful.
Yes, very much so. I think I was sitting here as I was listening to you, thinking of the various ways the New Testament refers back to this. I mean, I was thinking in one section that Moses couldn't bring them into the land, but Joshua did. And seems to be a parallel almost between the Old Testament law and the coming one, Jesus, who will overthrow sin and bring people into a possession that they won't lose, because Peter's very, very clear that for those who've put our trust in Jesus, that there is a guaranteed inheritance that's kept in heaven for us. So it's like, there's a patch, if you like, or a bit of land that has your name on it, just as, if you're a Reubenite or a Simeonite or a Levite, well, not Levites, because they're slightly different, but you would have a part of that land guaranteed for you, set apart for you. But then one of the remarkable things I find in the book, and it only struck me after quite a number of years, is the way when they know that they've got to destroy the indigenous population, the people who live there, that when they go into the city of Jericho and find Rahab and see her faith, they immediately offer her deliverance from the coming battle or siege. And they don't have to sort of send a messenger off to Joshua to say, can we do this or get permission? They, in spite of what God has commanded them, they seem to know, embedded in them, that their God is gracious and merciful. And even these wicked people, if they put their trust in the God of Israel, and then the God of Israel will save them. And that's just remarkable. Remarkable to see that that's filtered down, even to these two spies. They know this. What do you think on that, Andy?
Yeah, I think Rahab is a wonderful example. and the Gibeonites would be the others, if you know about them, showing that actually this is not genocide as such. There is scope for people born Canaanites to actually join the people of God and escape the judgment. And both the Gibeonites and Rahab say fascinating things. Perhaps you can look that up in your own time about what they've learnt about God from what he's doing in bringing them in. And it's a wonderful indication of actually how they've come to have faith that this is the real God and they need to be on his side and surrender to him. But let me just address this, because there is a big objection, Colin, and the objection tends to go, well, God is ordering the destruction, the wiping out of certain Canaanite populations. Not all their enemies. You see that in Deuteronomy 20. He says it makes a distinction between the people of the land and other people, but certain peoples in the land, God commands the complete obliteration of. And not just the fighting age men. He's talking about women. He's talking about children as well. And obviously that's a point that a lot of people struggle with, because clearly it's not something we'd ever want to do today. So how do we make sense of that? It's a difficult question, and it's a moral and emotive challenge to the goodness of God. So let me just address it for a bit. The immediate point, which must be said and cannot be underlined enough, is that nowhere in the New Testament or elsewhere, when we read the whole Bible, are Christians encouraged to copy or replicate what happened to the Canaanites. There's no question of this justifying religious violence today, and the sort of things that happened in Bosnia and Rwanda and the Third Reich. Jesus tells us we are to love our enemies, and our struggle is not with flesh and blood. And because we're not under the Israelite theocracy, we're in a different covenant at a different point in Bible history. It doesn't apply like that. That must be said. But we still got the problem, haven't we? Okay, God's not ordering us to kill Canaanites today, but he did then. So does that mean he's morally evil? And let me shut down two weak defense arguments that I've found through reading people like James Robson, and who depends on Chris Wright for these. He brings out arguments, for example, a defense that says, well, Joshua isn't really historical, it's all just allegories, so we just take it as a parable. The trouble is, the book of Joshua is clearly history writing, with a lot of geographic information about the peoples and the land and all the information about them. It's historical narrative, and we are to take it as history. Another problem is, another weak defense rather, is that the idea that, well, maybe the Israelites thought God was telling them to kill people, but actually he wasn't. They misunderstood what God had said. And the problem with that is the text just does not let us get away with that. The text clearly says these are things commanded by God. And if we think the Bible is God's true word, we simply don't have room to write this off as human error. So it's basically wishful thinking to say that, and it doesn't do justice to the text. So what do we do? Well, Stephen Lloyd has a great phrase in his Evangelicals Now article on this from a few years ago. He says, we need to understand what happened to the Canaanites, quote, within the Bible's moral framework. Within the Bible's moral framework. It's all very well us bringing our assumptions today about what's right and wrong to understand this, but actually we need to think about what is the Bible's moral framework and how does this make sense within that? And what is the Bible's moral framework? How does the Bible understand this destruction? It understands it as a punishment, a specific punishment on a specific group of people for sin. You see that back in Genesis 15 with Abraham. When God makes his covenant with Abraham, he talks about the sin of the Amorites has not yet reached its full measure, but eventually the Israelites are going to come back, the idea is, and that their coming will be a judgment on these sinners. Leviticus 18, do not defile yourselves in any of these ways, because this is how the nations I am going to drive out before you became defiled. Even the land was defiled, so I punished it for its sin, and the land vomited out its inhabitants. So we've got this perspective from God that actually, although we see people on the outside, God sees the heart and he sees the inside, and he sees these Canaanites and he says they are defiled. He points out their sin, and we're all sinners, aren't we? But God makes a specific point of saying this group of people I choose to punish in a certain way How and guys say these Canaanites are cancerously immoral. That's the language they use. And you can read in Leviticus 18 of all the ways they would behave and all their ethics, which is all over the place, which God says, you are not to be like that. And so the Bible understands this as a specific judgment against specific people. And that's not saying anyone has the right to go and kill anyone. But the specific case, God chooses to express his judgment against a specific group of people. And this is why we need to talk about the Bible's moral framework and not my moral framework. Because as a modern secular liberal, my framework is, well, all killing is automatically wrong, except abortion, of course. But all killing is automatically wrong. And the Bible's framework is actually, no, the wages of sin is death. How many times in this series have we seen people die? Think back to Numbers and people dying in the wilderness as God judges his people with plagues, with death. Think about Leviticus, Nadab and Abihu getting burnt up by the holiness of God. Think about Pharaoh being drowned in the Red Sea. We see God taking life for sin again and again. So the moral framework the text has built up is not that it's an outrage that anyone dies. It's an outrage that anyone lives. It's amazing that God holds back his wrath from most of us and doesn't punish us as we deserve. That's the moral framework that we need actually to understand Joshua with. And once you've accepted, A, that sin deserves death, and B, that God has the right to take life, the objections start to sort of fall apart. Because if God has the right to take life, who are we to say how and when he may or may not do that? Is it pretty? No. Is it nice? No. Am I glad that we don't have to repeat it? Yes, absolutely. But at the end of the day, if God is punishing sin and God is allowed to do that, then we don't really have a leg to stand on in calling him immoral. We might further object, well, what about the children? But are the children sinners in the Bible? Are children sinful? David in Psalm 51 says he's sinful from the very beginning of his life. And either way, we can trust the judge of the earth to do what is right, because the Bible guarantees that God is just. And if you say, well, oh, this is, no, we don't think God should punish sin. We don't think he has the right to take life. What do you do with the gospel? What gospel do you have left? What do you do with the cross? What is happening on the cross? Why did Jesus have to die? Is that just a gesture? Is he just showing us his love by throwing his life away for no reason? Is he perhaps dying a death that no one actually deserved? Do you think God would let his son die the way he died on the cross if the punishment for sin was not death and that punishment didn't need to be taken? You see, actually, if you don't accept that sin deserves death and God has a right to take it, you really struggle to believe the gospel, because the gospel is premised on the idea, the bad news that sets up the good news, that we are sinners and under God's judgment. Let me make one point that brings us nicely back to the book of Joshua and the love of God, actually, in a strange way. Do you know what happens to the kings in Joshua? The kings of the Canaanites, they are killed, yes, and dragged from their caves in one instance, but they are hung. They are hung on poles, on wooden poles. And that might take us back to Deuteronomy 21, where it says, cursed is anyone who is hung on a tree. The kings of the Canaanites are killed, and they are hung on trees because they are under God's curse. They are under his judgment. Isn't it therefore staggering that the way Israel's true king dies is hung on a tree? What is Jesus doing on the cross? He is dying the death we deserve. He is taking the fate of the Canaanites. He is suffering the fate of the Canaanites. He is suffering the curse, becoming a curse for us, Galatians says, to deliver us from that curse. And so actually, that is such a demonstration of God's love, isn't it? That Jesus loves us so much that he doesn't want us to suffer that fate of death, but he would be willing to take it on himself and die in our place, impaled on that tree, nailed to the cross, as it were, for our sake, to save us. And that demonstrates God's severity in his judgment. It also demonstrates his love. And that is the gospel. This is the unfashionable stuff that people don't like to talk about because, there's blood, there's sacrifice, there's sin. But make no doubt, A, this is what the Bible teaches. We see it in the Old Testament, we see it in the New. And B, this is the foundation of the good news. That Jesus loves us so much, he suffers the curse and the punishment of God that we see a taste of terrifyingly in the book of Joshua because of his love for us. And that's how he brings us into his rest, Colin.
Yeah. I know Peter Williams, when I heard him speaking about the destruction of all of those tribes, mentioned the two fighter pilots, I think one was a man, one was a woman, who were tracking the aircraft that eventually hit the Pentagon. But because they had launched without any weapons on board, they were contemplating who would take the tail out, who would take the cockpit out. Because they were aware of the evil that would happen if they allowed this plane to continue on to its objective. And I wonder a little bit, he was posing the question, you know, with the evil of the people of the Canaanites, if they were left as they were, and what the impact they would have had upon the society of their day. And I know God needed to judge them. But we don't know where history would have gone if the people of Israel had left all of those people alive. Yeah, God knew.
Well, that sets us up very nicely for Judges 1, actually, and Judges 2, because we will find out how many actually survived and the influence that was had in Israel. But that is next week's thing to consider. The big headline from today is God gives the victory. He gives the victory and he brings us into his rest by suffering that punishment, that awful judgment that we deserve, and taking it completely and sacrificing himself on the cross to do that. And that's something we need to fix our eyes on and be assured that he can bring us into his rest. And that's the truth we need to remember at the moment. Yeah. Well, Colin, thank you very much for joining me. Hopefully we'll see you on Sunday for the Sunday stream. Join us next week for the book of Judges. And until then, stay close to Jesus.
And wash your hands.